At this time, I have two identities. One is Nell Irvin Painter, who's speaking to you about this scholarly book called The History of White People, which I published as a historian. But I also have an identity as Nell Painter, who's a visual artist. And actually, The History of White People came out in the first year of my graduate study in painting at the Rhode Island School of Design. So that was pretty awkward. But I was pivoting from writing purely as a historian into visual art and then into literary nonfiction, which is where I see myself now. So in literary nonfiction, I published a memoir of my experiences as an old lady in art school called Old in Art School, a memoir of starting over. That was 2018. And right now I have in press a collection of my essays, primarily more scholarly essays, but including my op-eds and my sort of thinking out loud in the New York Times and the New Yorker and so forth. So it's called I Just Keep Talking. And Doubleday will publish that in early 2024. It's going to take a while because it also includes my art, and it's going to be printed in Italy. And then next year, before I Just Keep Talking comes out, but while it's well on its way, I will start work on a new biography of Sojourner Truth. I wrote a scholarly biography of Sojourner Truth a quarter century ago, in which I explained that she was a New Yorker and that she was not the one who said, "Aren't I or ain't I a woman?" A white woman journalist said that 12 years after the fact, but that didn't get through. So my new Sojourner Truth book, which Penguin will publish, is called Sojourner Truth Was a New Yorker, and she didn't say that.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And your art is very nice. I've had a chance to look at some of the...
Thank you. You can see it on my website, nellpainter.com.
Yes, and we'll link to that in the bio. So maybe you could give us kind of an overview of what the history of white people attempts to do and what you
Sure
in doing it.
I started that book because I had a question about white people, what Americans are called Caucasian, because most of us, including me when I started, had no idea what or where the Caucasus is. I know that now, and I actually am able to follow the terrible war in Ukraine because that area is around the region that gave us Caucasians for white people. I wanted to answer that question. So just answering that question took me to Göttingen, Germany, which is where the professor, the scholar, Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, gave that name to white people because the most beautiful skull in his collection was of a Georgian sex slave, not because she was a sex slave, but because her skull was really good looking. And he decided that of the 5 varieties of people, the most beautiful would be the Georgian, who was a Caucasian. So the most beautiful people are Caucasians, whom we now think of as white people. The others were at the extreme, because this was a horizontal, it was not a vertical. It was a horizontal. And so the beautiful Caucasian Georgian skull was in the middle. And then at one extreme was the Asian skull, which he thought was ugly because it was squarish and blocky. And then in between was the Malay, that is the Pacific Islander. And then at the other extreme was the African, which he thought was ugly. And then in between was the American Indian. So it's a five-fold classification. So that was at the very end of the 18th century. But of course, I couldn't just leave it there. You know, how did classification from Germany in the 18th century enter into, say, scholarly discourse in the 20th and the 21st century in the United States? So that took several chapters. And then I also had to go backwards in time because so many Americans assume that the way Americans think about race now has always been so. And so therefore, since race is supposed to be biological and scientifically attested to, that it must be for all time. And so the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans must always have thought of themselves as white people or Caucasians or whatever. So I had to which I found riveting, a lot of work in antiquity. So I start off in antiquity with Julius Caesar's wars in what we now think of as France, which he called Gaul.
Well, and this is one of the things that struck me so immediately about the book is that the history of white people is really wrenching whiteness from and out of kind of this complicated history of non-whiteness and whiteness. So it's not othering necessarily people of different color or skin tone. It's really kind of figuring out who is the whitest of the white, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that. That's part of it. It's not the whitest of the white. It's the best, the smartest, the most beautiful, the most powerful. It depends on when we're talking about. The basic meaning of this book is that things change. So often people will say, well, you know, you've talked about all these different ways of thinking about race, but what's true? And there is no scientific truth of race. I mean, we have social classifications of racism, which are very true because they are manifested psychologically and materially. You know, I can't wish away racial discrimination just because it's based on something that is not biological. Racism is true. Racism exists. But ideas about race, about who are white people, what are they like, where are they, that changes depending on who's asking the question and who's answering it and why the question is asked and what the answer means within a particular context. So there's no scientific answer about race, even though people have tried over 300 years to offer that. So I go through several ways of thinking about defining whiteness. The hardest thing for people to understand, even after they've read my book, is that 100 years ago, well-educated people thought there was more than one white race. So many people say, oh, you become white. No, people from Ireland or people from Italy or people from Croatia, if the men, the adults came and could vote, they were thought of as white, but they were inferior kinds of white people. But they still had the ballot, and that's a crucial thing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make. And I think I kind of want to go back to where you began with this notion of, you said something that I think a lot of people are going to take kind of like, what does a beautiful skull even mean? So, I mean, how can you like take what is an not uneducated, but unscientific anthropology?
Sure.
See skulls of human skulls, right?
Sure. No. You will understand immediately when I say it had no dings or rents, and it had all its teeth, which meant that it was a young person. And because of its configuration, Jan Friedrich Blumenbach could figure out, he didn't have to figure out from its configuration. The cover letter that came with the skull explained that it had come from a young Georgian, and she had died of venereal disease in Moscow. So it was clear that it was a young woman's skull. And I have seen that skull in Göttingen, actually. It's not quite as pretty as it was in 1795, but in 1795, it was practically pristine. It had all its teeth. And that's a really big deal. So it's a young person. And as a woman, it's a young woman who had not been pregnant, because in those days, and probably still, pregnancy deprives women of calcium, deprives women of their teeth.
Right. And then there's this notion, kind of continuing from that, of race equaling beauty and kind of like physical stature. And then kind of get into how masculinity comes into that.
Yeah, but let me go back to a moment to, you ask why a skull could be considered beautiful. And skulls were the way you classified people in the 18th century. And we don't do that so much anymore. In the 19th and early 20th century, it was the Cephalic Index. So it was rather, did you have a long face? Was your skull long? Was your face broad? So the Cephalic Index was the way to tell. And, who knows what that is now and who cares? But it was really important in the early 20th century. So what is important now about whiteness? And, again, it's who's asking and where and why. It used to be protected by laws in the United States. It was less who white people are, but who they weren't. So, if you have that one drop, then you're not white. Or if you have 1/8 of your ancestors of African descent, you're not white. But whiteness was protected by laws and also by just the white male default assumption that, no, you don't belong here. So I grew up in California in the mid-20th century, which was a kind of a segregated society, really. And, it wasn't because the laws were written down. There were just places you didn't go and houses you couldn't buy. And that would be the case throughout most of the North until very recently. And there's still places you can't go and houses you can't buy. So how you decide what whiteness means changes by time and place. So you ask about masculinity. So one problem for somebody like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's the great master of whiteness theory, he wouldn't have said whiteness, he would have said Saxons, because he considered himself a Saxon, was masculinity. He was very anxious about that. And the problem was that Blumenbach's skull was a woman's skull. And beauty is generally thought of as something that women have. So Ralph Waldo Emerson had to go back into what he considered the Saxon history, and we would call it Anglo-Saxon, because he didn't mean Saxony in Germany. He didn't mean Dresden or Leipzig. He meant this sort of never land. It wasn't exactly Lower Saxony, which is around Hanover, which is where Göttingen is. It was a sort of kind of a Denmark in a way, but he went back to the Northmen. And his idea was the Vikings were kind of the root of Saxons, and they were very masculine and they were very vicious. And he thought this was great.
Yeah, and that notion of like beauty turning into brutality is something that we see kind of, I mean, it becomes codified in the Americas, definitely, over slavery, but it's very interesting that it made that philosophical leap into the whiteness.
Yeah, I wrote 3 chapters on Emerson, who, when I started, I didn't know I was going to do that. But as I was reading around in 19th century commentary, he just rose to the top. And he wrote a book called English Traits, which is a race book. And in fact, one of the chapters is called Race, when he talks about his being a Saxon as a good thing. Yeah.
And he also kind of ties it to this race equals blood, right? And that's when you were speaking about 1/8 is, a corruption. It's the blood libel kind of thing too. And I guess, that kind of leads us into this, what we would consider today pseudoscience, but at the time was, we're talking 1830s, right?
I am dealing with science. There's some crackpots in there, but I stuck to what was respectable science at the time. And I must say, though, if I were writing now, I would write differently about white supremacists and white nationalists, because writing in the early 21st century, I could acknowledge their existence. And I could say, these people are why it's so, part of the reason why it's so difficult for white Americans to embrace whiteness, because it's a spoiled identity. To embrace whiteness is to say, I'm a Klansman, basically. I'm a Nazi. And most people don't want to do that. So I could kind of set that story aside. But since the Trump era, when Trump has become ever closer to white nationalists, they need to be taken, their history needs to be delved in more deeply than I was able to do. So mine is more of a mainstream history of whiteness than a current treatise on whiteness as it is now. I have made art about American identities, American whiteness since Trump. I made that in 2020, just before coronavirus closed everything down. And I did have to bring in people like Steve Bannon.
And I think some of the, when I mentioned pseudoscience, I kind of thought of like phenology and the eugenics movement, and which led to like some terrible results of sterilization and things like that.
Yeah, eugenics. I did spend a good deal of time with eugenics. And one thing I needed to point out is that eugenics was not about stigmatizing Black people. It was about stigmatizing people considered feeble-minded or morons or whatever. And the main targets were poor white people, especially poor white Southerners. So Carrie Buck, whose case in the mid-20s allowed forced sterilization, was a poor white Virginian.
And the Jukes too. We used to have a reference copy of that we kept in the office here at the library.
Uh-huh.
It was, no one really knew what it was at the time.
Yeah.
You could tie, because I think that there's an important element of whiteness versus, like what you said, feeble-mindedness, criminality, degeneration.
Yeah.
Some of the things that
that's the Jukes story. Yeah. And that was a New York story. So a lot of that thinking comes out of the North, really.
And I guess it's interesting too, because when I started the book, I thought whiteness would be kind of propped up against blackness,
Mm-hmm.
other skin tone,
Mm-hmm.
but really it was against these kind of North versus Southern, and not in an American context, but kind of like in Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, and
Mm-hmm.
where you came from through immigration, and
Right.
how,
Right.
and that led to criminality. There were these weird connections that were made.
Yeah. Well, class is a really big factor in how people think about race, whether it's white race or other race. Class. In the United States, we have a lot of trouble thinking straightforwardly about class, what it means to be poor, what the stereotypes are of wealth or poverty. We're much more comfortable translating that into Black people or Black and brown people. But I'd like to think that we're getting better of dealing with class as well as race and gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and there's that Max Weber quote you mentioned about how it's not enough for the privilege to just be privileged. They have to be somehow deserving of the privilege.
They have to be deserving. They think of themselves as deserving. Yeah.
So I think one of the things I had written down was or wanted to kind of hit on was this how anti-Semitism and the anti-Irish kind of play into this notion of whiteness.
Yeah. Let me take them one after the other. The Irish story is probably easier to understand because I think Irish people are now, some people think of Irish Catholics as WASP, which has the word Protestant in it, but as people who are safely ensconced in their whiteness, don't have to explain it, don't have any hyphens or anything like that. And that story really shows you how class plays its part, because in the middle of the 19th century, when there was this wave of impoverished, uneducated Irish people, they were considered white. I mean, the men could vote right away. They were considered white, but they were considered members of an inferior white race. So remember I said that Emerson thought of himself as a Saxon, that was the superior. And he thought of Irish people as Celts. And there's a whole, late 19th century, there was a whole movement to sort of rehabilitate Celts, who were considered this poor, ignorant, little snub people who went to war and always lost and things like that. But what happened in the United States, and to a certain extent in Britain too, that with access to the ballot, Irish Americans could get access to jobs. So the stereotype of the Irish policeman or the Irish fireman, I mean, they're rooted in 19th century experience. So the first generation was, impoverished immigrants who had virtually no schooling. Their children, after they had voted, after their fathers had voted, then could get jobs and wages, and then send their children to school. And so the grandchildren, the girls, are school teachers, and the boys are policemen and firemen. But by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, we get to another wave of poor European immigrants, and they get denigrated as being ignorant and dirty and substandard intelligence, because by the time we get to the First World War, we also encounter the use of intelligence testing on people in the armed services. So they are, you could say racialized, but they're not racialized in the sense that they're called, they're called members of the North Italian race, members of the South Italian race, members of the Slavish race. So, but meanwhile, the Irish Americans who've been on this sort of elevator get reclassified, a new classification in around the time of the First World War. It's called Nordic. And so Nordic includes Ireland with France and Germany and the Netherlands and so forth. So that's how Irish Americans made their way through the steps of whiteness in a way, but they were always white. The new immigrants get stigmatized, and there's a terrible backlash in Congress, and immigration gets cut off. So it gets cut off in the mid 1920s. And so 2 generations later, those descendants call themselves white ethnics. They know they're not Black. They're disturbed by Black pride. They say, well, we're proud too. We're proud to be Italian. We're proud to be Croatian. We're proud to be Greek, and so forth. So, we have this continuing rejiggering of racial classification in our public life. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think the anti-Semitism kind of, again, brings us back to class a little bit, because it's the Russian Revolution that feeds a lot of this in America, right?
Yeah. Let me start even before the Russian Revolution with the great classic book, The Races of Europe. The question is, what do you do with Jewish people? Because on the one hand, Jewish people are different. But on the other hand, they look like the people they live around. So you can't make all these measurements and get the Jews into their own place. So over and over again, racial classification stumbles on Jewish people, and stumbles even more as the generations go from the early 20th century immigrants to their children and their children's children, and with a recognition that there are Jewish Americans who by no stretch are white. So in a way, I mean, this sounds so perverse, that the clearest judge of Jewishness is anti-Semitism, which really is criminal.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point. I think Sartre wrote that book, What is a Jew? And basically said, if the Jew doesn't exist, we have to invent them, right?
Yeah. And anti-Semitism can exist without Jews, as in Hungary and Poland and Russia.
All right. So I think I would just want to kind of end this discussion on bring us up to date. Where are we? Where are we today?
Depends on who you ask and where you're talking to and so forth. I wrote a lot since 2020, and one of my anthologized pieces is Capitalized White. It was originally in the Washington Post, but my point there, and I'm not the only one who says this, is that it's right that we capitalize Black, but we also need to capitalize white for different reasons. We capitalize Black out of respect, but we need to capitalize white out of recognition, because white race identity is as fraught and important socially and historically as other racial identities. But part of that identity is you don't have a racial identity. You're an individual. That's part of what it means to be white. So I say capitalize white so we can see it. And one of the things Trump has done is make whiteness visible.
Yeah, and I think that your point earlier about the white kind of supremacy movement and this white nationalism that's coming to the forefront is incredibly well made. And I think maybe if you could kind of talk, I'd love for you to kind of end with your art and what you're hoping to achieve with that too, because you said then.
Well, I make my art for my own satisfaction. When I was a historian, I would start with a question. Why are white people called Caucasian? I didn't have a larger, I want people to take this away from my book. No, I wanted to write a book that was well-researched and well-written on a topic that I thought needed more attention. But, I didn't have a larger role for this book to play. And that's true about my art. I make my art for my own pleasure. And the beauty of making art is that I don't have to be faithful to the archive. As a historian, I had to be faithful to the archive so that even if you disagreed with me from beginning to end, you would know that what I said was sound. But if you look at my art, you can take away from it what you please.